Well, I think you would have to be living under a rock to not know what happened in the early wee hours of the morning on Tuesday, November 7th in Tustin, California. I don't know if you have seen this or not, or did see it in person, but if you live in Tustin, if you live around Tustin, you know something about this right here when this hangar caught on fire, and it kind of became a big deal, lots of news. And as a resident of Irvine, not of Tustin, so I have to first say that, I will say, like, kind of iconic here, like iconic hangars here, like the Tustin logo, even in the city seal, is kind of all functioning around the hangars. Like it is it is the symbol of the city of Tustin. It's a big deal, and it caught on fire. How it caught on fire, I don't know. Was it Irvine Company? I don't know. I'm not here to debate who started the fire or what exactly happened, but I do know this fire here changed a lot of your lives. It changed a lot of your lives because it wasn't just that day when it was actually flames were up in the air and the smoke went up into the sky as well. But there was this little tiny microscopic thing that changed all of your lives, this thing called asbestos. Do you know what asbestos is? Frankly, I didn't really know much about asbestos before it became a big deal with the hangars. But asbestos is this little tiny fiber-like, it's like multiple, like 6, I would say, different chemicals that they did to these little needle-sized fibers that they would use in old buildings. Specifically back, again, reading the history about it, like back in World War II especially, asbestos was a big thing that they used in the construction of their buildings. Obviously, the hangars were built in around World War II for the blimps, and basically what it does is it's a structural support. It's kind of insulation for a building to be able to function, to stand until it catches fire, and do what it needs to do. But this little tiny asbestos changed a lot of your lives. I know it canceled a lot of your schools. It closed a lot of parks. It gave you time off from school. It made you go back to online learning for many of you, at least for a couple of days. But if you look into what asbestos is, which I did, because I'm just like, come on, man, really got to close schools for this little thingy that falls from the sky. I've heard this story before. Don't go outside because there's a lung disease that might happen to you, so you have to go do indoor learning. I've heard this story before. So anyway, I was like, oh, what's the big deal? Reading about asbestos, it's actually kind of a big deal. If you look at the screen there, it's like he's got it like on tweezers where it's super, super small. And if any of those pieces gets in your lungs, it will never come out of your lungs, is what I learned. Like these little fiber needle things, they go into your lungs and they kind of lodge themselves there. And lots of times it causes certain types of lung cancer or mesothelioma or different diseases that you don't want if you breathe in asbestos into your lungs. And so what they did is they closed these schools, they closed these parks to get you to stay inside. Did any of you guys stay inside perfectly the whole time? Didn't? No, you didn't, right? Because you went to the store, you went to church, you did a lot of stuff outside. Maybe you still went to the parks when they were closed. I don't know exactly what you did. But what they tried to get you to do with these closures is to say, I want you to stay home and to stay out of possibly breathing in these airs. They didn't say, if you walk outside, you will die. I hope they didn't say that to you. If they did, they were lying to you because that's not true. You're still alive right now. I'm still alive right now. I went outside. You went outside. So the danger wasn't necessarily, if you go outside, you will die. It was not a 1-to-1 ratio. But what their theme, what their motto was don't go to school, don't go to the parks, because if you go outside, you might get exposed. That's what they would constantly say. You might get exposed. You might breathe it in. You might get it on your skin or something like that if you lived near the hangars. And so what they were trying to do is close the schools to make you spend less time outside than you typically do on a regular week. And so their theory was if you spend less time outside, then there is a less likely chance that you get sick. If you spend more time outside or a regular amount of time outside, there's a higher percentage for you to get sick. Again, so it was all a percentage game. It was a less likely, more likely. I'm going to try to keep you inside to make it less likely that you end up getting sick. I think this asbestos situation kind of gives us a picture, I think a helpful illustration to what our relationships look like with one another. Follow me for 1 second. I think this asbestos situation teaches us actually something about Christmas break specifically, because I think it kind of like the asbestos situation, the longer you are exposed to being outside, the higher chance you have of something bad happening to you. And I think oftentimes in relationships, the longer that you are with people, the more likely of a chance you have to have issues with people, to have friction, to have disagreements, to have fights. Specifically people that you have a long-standing history with, people that you've fought with before, people that you've had friction with or frustration with or anger with before. And those people specifically, the more time that you spend with them, the higher chance that something bad might happen. You guys are all sitting in a couple of weeks on the precipice of Christmas break, where what you're going to do in Christmas break is you are going to spend a lot of time with the people that you have the most and longest history with, your parents. And you have a history with them. I know this because you grew up in their house and you're not a perfect person and they're not a perfect parent. And every person in this room has fought with their parents before. Every person in this room has disrespected their parents before. Every person in this room has disobeyed their parents before. And the longer amount of time that you spend with them over Christmas break, the higher chance, the higher probability that you will have issues with them. And so what I want to do this morning for us as we continue this Christmas Sin series, start to talk about your relationship with your parents, that you might not disrespect them, you might not disobey them over Christmas break when you're spending more time with them. I can think back to my time when I was in school, Christmas break, those 2 weeks of Christmas break were the most that I fought with my mom all year long, because it was just, we were together more often. And you're together with your siblings and things happen, clashes happen, fights happen, frustration happens. And you ought to be, the more time you spend with them, actually on the other side, the more likely to be righteous and holy the way that God has called you. So I'd love for you to open up to Colossians chapter 3 this morning with me. Colossians chapter 3. As we talk about parental disrespect, your disrespect towards your parents. That doesn't necessarily mean that every Christmas break is going to be World War III. That's not what I'm saying. But what I am saying is that there is a higher probability that you will have more disrespect towards your parents when you spend more time with them. And you need to be extra mindful, especially those 2 or 3 weeks that you have over Christmas break, to make sure that you are the most respectful, the most obedient, the most God-fearing, God-honoring child to your parents during that time. Colossians chapter 3, we're going to look at verses 20 and 21, a verse to children and actually a verse to parents as well. And I think this will be really helpful for us as we think about our Christmas breaks, as you think about your respect for your parents, that you might honor them, respect them, and obey them the way that God has called you to. So let's read these 2 verses. Kind of picks it up in this long summary about the gospel, how the gospel changes lives. But let's read these 2 verses and then we'll kind of break down the context and everything around it. Colossians chapter 3, verse 20, it says this, very simply, plain English, verse 20, children, obey your parents in everything, for this pleases the Lord. Fathers, do not provoke your children, lest they become discouraged. These 2 verses, I think, will be really helpful for you in your Christmas break, that you avoid conflict, that you avoid friction, that you avoid frustration, disobedience, and disrespect towards your parents. So like I said, this Colossians section in chapter 3 is a big, long section about the gospel, and it's going to look a lot like where we're going to get to in a few months in Ephesians chapter 4 and chapter 5 specifically. It's talking about how the gospel changes your life. But specifically, if you are a Christian, what you are saying, if you're a Christian, you are saying the gospel has changed every piece of my life. That affects my church life, that affects my school life, and that most definitely affects your home life as well. So if you are a Christian, if you claim to be a Christian, you ought to be a Christian at home. You ought to act like a Christian, live like a Christian at home, where if you believe in the gospel will change your home life, and it will change it completely. And so what he does here is he breaks it down into the different people in the household. So he talks to wives, he talks to husbands, he talks to children, he talks to parents, he talks to bondservants, basically slaves who would live in the house. He also talks to masters of those bondservants. So basically what he's trying to say is every person, your life will be changed by the gospel. And so what he does here in these 2 verses is he addresses children and he addresses fathers. None of you, other than, I guess, a couple of your leaders, none of you are the fathers in verse 21. None of you are the parents. None of you have kids. So why are we talking about a verse that is to parents and to kids. Well, what I want to do is I want to first start with verse 21 and break this down for you and to show you that this command to parents, not to you, to parents, I think gives you helpful context, helpful perspective even for your relationship with your parents and what it should look like, or at least the way that God has called you to, the way that God has called you and your parents to interact. So if you look back at verse 21, it says, fathers, do not provoke your children lest they become discouraged. So you could read this verse and you could say, okay, this verse might be helpful for me in, whatever, 10, 15, 20 years from now when I'm a parent and I've got kids. And you can sit there and you can skip over that verse and say, it doesn't apply to me. I'm not a parent. That's okay. But I want you to do is I want you to see in this verse how difficult the role of being a parent is, because what this does is this tells fathers and mothers to parent a certain way. It tells them to not provoke their children lest they discourage their children. And so what it does here is it explains a parental temptation that your parents will have in their relationship to you, which should help you interact and have the right relationship going backwards the other way to your parents. So what I want you to do is write this down this way for point 1. I want you to recognize the difficulty of parenting. I think this will be helpful in your relationship with your parents if you first recognize the difficulty of parenting. Recognize the difficulty of parenting. God would not be writing a verse to parents and tell them how to do their life, tell them how to parent if parenting was easy, if parenting was second nature, if parenting was just a walk in the park. He's writing this because fathers and mothers have a temptation, specifically in this verse, to provoke their children and therefore, as a result, to discourage their children. So what does this mean here, to provoke? It says, fathers, do not provoke your children. What is provoke? Provoke is the idea of to irritate, to embitter, to stir up, to make upset. It says, lest they become discouraged. They're called to lead in love. So the picture of this that he's trying to correct is the parent that is over the top angry with their child. Over the top setting such high expectations that their child will never meet it. Then they just become discouraged and say, why do I even try to please my mom and dad? Because they're such perfectionists and they never say they're proud of me and they never say they love me and they're never, telling me a good job. And what it says here is that parents are going to be tempted to do that, to treat you in the opposite way, to provoke you and to discourage you. And so, again, you could step back and say, sweet, I'm going to go home. Parents say, what'd you learn in the car? I learned about fathers not provoking their children. So stop it. Like, you could get in the car. When they ask you, what'd you learn at church? Just say, I learned how to be a parent and how not to be a parent. You're doing a bad job. I would recommend none of you to go home, because you would be destroyed in point number 2 if you were to go home and you were to do that. This verse is not for you to go wave it in front of your parents and say, you're not doing this. This verse is for you to say, wow, that seems really difficult. And I'm going to put myself in their shoes and see how difficult it would be to parent me. This is not a parent versus kid conversation where it's like you're going to go home and say, you're not doing this or you're not doing that. This is for you to see that you actually should treat your parent more like a teammate rather than an opponent, where they're trying to help you, they're trying to disciple you. If they're a Christian mother or father, they're trying not to provoke you and they're trying not to discourage you, as this verse says. It is a temptation for parents to provoke their children. Maybe you've seen that in your household. And again, I'm sorry that that's the case. I would love to talk with your parents of how to not do that, of course. But if you're a child, you need to understand their temptation to you to give you perspective. What do I mean by this? Well, I want you to think about it this way. I want you to think about perspective being a helpful way for you to understand them better. What is perspective? It's you being able to put yourself in their shoes and understand where they're coming from. Kind of like what happens every year for the Tustin team at Revival. This happens every single year, okay? So high school team, Team Volcanoes, it happens every year. You guys, you get to Revival and you're like, we have such a bad team. Oh, we have no one on our team. Look at our guys. Like they're not like that big. Like you complain, and you're known as the complainers. I'm just gonna put it out there. Known as the complainers. But this is what happens every time that you play Steal the Bacon at Revival, and Steal the Bacon, and Hunger Games specifically. Those two games, it kind of flares up even more. Let's take Steal the Bacon for example. Steal the Bacon, you number yourselves off 1 to 14 or 15 or 16, whatever it is. And if you have, let's just say you have 7 girls on your team, that means all of you have to go twice. And so when they call, girls, 5, 7, 9, 11, 5, 7, 9, 11, go, 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 and you go, you are number 5, but then when they call the even numbers, you are also number 6. And so when they call 6, 8, 10, 6, 8, 10, you go twice in a row. And I sit there at the booth with Pastor John, or in junior high with Pastor Jacob, and I sit there and I'm just like, man, look at those. They're not even trying. Look at this is my students. What are they doing? Why do they look so tired out there? And you come to me after and you say, I had 3 numbers. I went every single round. Of course I was tired. Everyone else, they get to go once. They have full energy in the tank. They're ready to go. And yeah, I can't full dead sprint down to the water. I can't do all the things I need to do because I just went 7 times in a row. I'm exhausted. What is that? That's a picture of perspective. That's a picture of me sitting in the booth not saying, look at that lazy team right there. That's me saying, oh, wow, I understand their situation. I actually understand they're a really tired team. Maybe they need a couple of those games crew to hop in and jump and be on their team, which has happened before. What is that? That's perspective. Me putting myself, I look at something and I can make an assumption, but then me putting myself then in your shoes to say, oh, that makes sense now. I get it. This verse is that perspective. Oh, my parents get mad at me? Oh, because now I understand how difficult their job is and how difficult their temptation to provoke me or to discourage me. Because you know your temptation to disobey them. We're going to get there in a minute in verse 20, where your job is to obey them. You know you don't do a perfect job. They don't do a perfect job. They're sinners. You're a sinner. So we've got a sinful parent and a sinful child. How do you think that's going to work out? There are going to be bumps along the road. There's going to be growing that needs to take place. But what this is perspective. So what I want you to do, I want you to have perspective with your parents to know their temptations, not to point your finger at them and say, you're not doing what the Bible tells you to do. But for you to go, oh, wow, they're going to be tempted to provoke me and to discourage me. Because remember this, in 95% of your fights with your parents, it takes 2 to tango. Sometimes it's just your fault. Sometimes it's just their fault. But like most of the time, 95% of the time, it takes 2 to tango. You get mad at them, they get mad at you, friction happens, and then a big issue blows up into a bigger problem. So therefore, you need to see that your job is to obey them, and you need to see their job is to not provoke you. So therefore, you should not be a child that provokes them constantly, that makes them upset at you more and more and try to push their buttons, try to get under their skin. You need to see your job to actually be your parents' teammate rather than their opponent. You need to make their job actually easier. Hebrews 13, verse 17, referring to spiritual leaders, referring to pastors, it says this. I think really it helps us see the relationship that you have with your parents. Hebrews 13, 17 says this, obey your leaders and submit to them, for they are keeping watch over your souls. As those who will have to give an account, let them do this with joy and not with groaning, for that would be no advantage to you. No one in this room likes upset parents. Do you love like going on vacation, your parents are like super mad at you? Does anyone enjoy when your parents are upset? No. Your job is to help them to make their job as much of a joy as possible, as easy as possible. Some of you make your parents' job so incredibly difficult. You push their buttons, you get under their skin, you know how to make them mad, you know what to do. This verse is telling you that you need to have their job, to make their job a joy. Look at the last phrase there. It says, for that would be of no advantage to you. You do it for their sake, but you also do it for your sake as well. Another one for you to write down, Proverbs 10:1. Proverbs 10:1 says this. It says, a wise son makes a father glad, but a foolish son is a sorrow to his mother. If you are wise, if you obey, if you respect, you will make your father and your mother glad. But if you do the opposite, you will hurt them. Think back to the last time you made your parents' job difficult. You made their job hard. Think back to that time. What did you do? You probably did something wrong, right, in that situation. You probably disobey them, disrespect them, whatever the case may be. And look at the last phrase there. A foolish son is a sorrow to his mother. Have you ever made your mom cry before? How does that feel? I've made my mom cry before. You've probably made your mom cry before. How does it feel? Pretty painful when you know that you are the reason for the tears that is in your mother's eyes. Again, your job is to make their job as much of a joy as possible, not make them cry. And again, that's not saying like, you are now the police of your mom's emotions. That's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is you can hurt them, you can gladden them as well. And it's always good for you when your father or your mother is glad and happy rather than upset and sad. Again, you think about it like school. When you have really angry teachers and teachers that, you've pushed their buttons multiple times, how does it go for you in those classes? They're always nitpicking you. They're always, making your tests even harder. They're trying to set you up for failure. Like, it's difficult when your teacher is against you because you've pushed their buttons. The same way in the home. If you keep pushing your parents' buttons, it's going to be harder for you. And again, going back to Hebrews 13:17, describing the leaders, it talks about them having care over your souls. Your parents have care over your soul. We'll get there when we get to Ephesians chapter 6, but Ephesians 6, verse 4, very similar to our passage, it says this. It says, children, do not provoke your children to anger. Or fathers, do not provoke your children to anger. It says, but bring them up in the discipline and the instruction of the Lord. Your parents' job is to bring you up. If you're a Christian parent, their job is to bring you up in the discipline and the instruction of the Lord. I've heard this so many times from teenagers before. My parents try to make my life miserable. My parents, they try to just ruin my life. And probably, most likely, they're saying that out of anger because they've grounded you or they disciplined you in some way. But if you've ever even thought that before, I want you to reverse that thought in your mind and say, no, that's not a true thought. That's not in alignment with what is true, because the Bible, if they're Christian parents, they are called to discipline and to instruct you in the Lord. They're not making your life miserable. They're actually protecting you from sin. I want you to turn over to Proverbs chapter 1 with me to see this. Proverbs chapter 1. Again, we've been in Proverbs quite a few times in the last few times together. The guys, we were in Proverbs on Wednesday at the guys' workshop, but also last week we were in Proverbs to talk about gluttony. Proverbs chapter 1 gives us that picture of the father writing to the son. Again, we explained that last week. We explained that last Wednesday as well to the guys. This is a book written from a father to a son so that they walk in wisdom. I want you to see this. Proverbs chapter 1, verse 8. It says this. It says, hear, my son, to your father's instructions, and forget not your mother's teachings. For they are a graceful garland on your head and pendants around your neck. And my son, if sinners entice you, do not consent. If they say, come with us, and let us lie in wait for blood. Let us ambush the innocent without reason. Like Sheol, let us swallow them alive and whole, like those who go down to the pit. For we shall find precious goods, and we shall fill our house with plunder. What he's describing here is people saying, hey, let's go murder someone, and let's go take their stuff. So again, murder and stealing. We've got a bad situation here, some bad friends that you're around. Verse 14, it says, throw in your lot among us, for we will all have one purse. Listen to this. Verse 15, he says, my son, do not walk in the way with them. Hold back your foot from their paths, for their feet run to evil, and they make haste to shed blood. In vain is their net spread in the sight of any bird, but these men lie in wait for their own blood, and they set an ambush for their own lives. Such are the ways of everyone who is greedy for unjust gain. It takes away the life of its possessors. What this passage here is teaching us, is that a parent, a godly parent, is instructing their child, their son or daughter, to stay away from sin. What he does here is he say, stay away from the friends that want to murder and steal. Again, that's kind of an extreme example. Hopefully you're not hanging around any murderers at school. You probably hang out with people that steal at school. But murderers, that's maybe another story. And what the father is doing is saying, hey, son, don't be around those people. Stay away from them because I don't want you to go fall into sin. Remember, your parents, if you have Christian parents, your parents want to protect you from sin. That's why they put up some rules for you. That's why they say, don't hang out with that friend. That's why they say, oh, we're going to put some blockers on your phone. That's why they say, these are not words that we use in our house. What they're doing is they're trying to protect you from sin. I need you to see that. And so next time you get upset at them, next time you feel like they're making your life unfair or they just hate you and they want to make your life miserable, I want you to see, put the glasses on that say, oh, actually my parents, they want to care for me. They don't want to just suck all the fun out of my life. They want to protect me from something like this. They want to protect me from sin. And so next time your parents call you out and say, don't do that, and you get upset at them and you want to backbite them, you want to complain to them, you want to disobey them, I want you to take a step back and say, are they protecting me from sin in this situation? And more often than not, that's what they're doing. Again, think about the discipline you've received. Maybe think of like the worst discipline you've ever received. You probably did something that was sinful or something that could have led to something even bigger sinful. Protection from sin is one of your parents' jobs. Therefore, their rules, their discipline, they're helpful ways for you to be protected from things that they know better than you to say, I don't want you to go down that path and I don't want you to go live in that sin. So it's appropriate for you to understand them, to appreciate them, to make their job a joy, to see where they're coming from, to put yourself in their shoes. But I want you to go back to Colossians chapter 3. We're going to spend the majority of our time together in verse 20, the verse to children specifically. The gospel has transformed your life and your position as a child. Colossians 3 verse 20 says this. It says, children, obey your parents in everything, for this pleases the Lord. As someone living at home, the gospel transforming your life and your home life, this is what it looks like for you to please God, to obey your parents in everything. Why? Because it pleases the Lord. Again, God has authority over every aspect of your life, including your home life. So therefore, when you obey your parents, you're obeying God. When you disobey your parents, you're disobeying God. So I want you to connect those two relationships together, your relationship with your parents and your relationship with God. Point number 2, write it down this way. Obey God by obeying your parents. Obey God by obeying your parents. That needs to be your strategy this Christmas season. When you're together with them and you want to backbite them, you want to disobey them, you want to disrespect them, I want you to think about this. You are called to obey them. That's the obvious portion. It says this, verse 20, it says, in everything. Why? Because this pleases God. Some of you have issues with your parents. Some of you have big issues with your parents. I know about them, some of them, not all of them. You need to see your issues with your parents as not a small deal, actually a big deal. People at school disrespect their parents, disobey their parents all the time, and they treat it like it's no big deal. If you're a Christian, I want you to make sure that you see when I disobey, when I disrespect, when I dishonor my parents, this is actually a reflection of my relationship with God. Therefore, it puts a lot of weight, it puts a lot of gravity behind that issue. Again, it seems obvious, but it seems obvious for us to obey our parents, but the implication is really important that we understand that it actually pleases or displeases God. So therefore, good news, flip it to the good news section. If you obey your parents, you're obeying God. And so that's a really good thing. But also, it's doubly bad on the other side. You disobey your parents, you're disobeying them, but then you're also disobeying God at the same time. It's like when you get your license. If you got your license, a couple of you have your license, it's great to get your license. It's awesome, but there is now a whole new set of rules that you have to abide by as someone with a license. One of those rules is curfew. Curfew. In that first year of your license, 16 to 17, or whenever you get your license, if you get it late, that's on you. But for me, 16 to 17, that year of my life, I was not allowed to drive, and you are not legally allowed to drive after 11 p.m. My parents had a curfew for me at 11 p.m. It was funny how those two things kind of match together. And so therefore, if I showed up at the house at 11:15, I was breaking my dad's rules, and I would get in trouble from him because I broke his rule. If I were to be pulled over by a cop at 11:15 p.m., I would have gotten in trouble with him. Those are two different people, two different authority structures, one with the state, one with my parents, But if I'm home by 10:59, my dad is happy, the cops are happy. If I show up at 11:15, my dad is mad, the cops are mad. Again, there are two different relationships here to this one rule of make sure that you are home by 11 p.m. Again, the consequence of me showing up late with my dad is one thing. Maybe he takes the car, maybe he grounds me, takes my phone, something like that. But if the cop pulls you over, the double consequence there is they take your license and you can't drive, period, I think until you're like 18 or something like that. It's a long time. You don't want to be caught by a cop or your parents after curfew because you're breaking two rules at the same time. What Paul does here is he explains that you as a child are obeying one authority structure and another one at the same time. So therefore, it was really important for me to make sure that I got home at 10:59 or before. And I was all good. And I got a thumbs up from both the cops and from my parents. That's a good thing. That's the place that you want to stay. That's the place that you want to be. Because when you don't do it, you grieve two separate sources of people. God is grieved every time you disobey your parents. I know that because I read Deuteronomy chapter 21. Deuteronomy chapter 21, verses 18 through 21. You don't need to turn there. It'll be on the screen. But this is what God's view of disobedient children is. It hurts God, and he is angry about it. Deuteronomy 21, verse 18 says this. It says, if a man has a stubborn and rebellious son who will not obey the voice of his father or the voice of his mother, and though they discipline him, he will not listen to them, then his father and mother shall take hold of him and bring him out to the elders of the city at the gate of the place where he lives. And they shall say to the elders of the city, this is our stubborn and rebellious son. He will not obey our voice. He's a glutton, shout out to last week, and a drunkard. Then it says, all of the men of the city shall stone him to death with stones. So you shall purge the minorly not great thing. No, you shall purge the evil from your midst, and all of Israel shall hear and shall fear. This is what God thinks about disobedient and rebellious children. Again, I'm not saying we're going to start stoning people when you disobey your parents. This is a different context, Old Testament, in the relationship with God to Israel there. But God didn't change his mind from Old Testament to New Testament about what he thinks about disobedient children. It's the same God. Maybe the punishment doesn't look the exact same, but this reflects God's heart. And so when you disobey, again, think about the person in the Old Testament that did the same thing and got stoned, got killed for it. And listen to what it says. You shall purge the evil from your midst. This is evil. God calls it evil when you don't obey your parents. It's a big deal. Another one for you to write down, Proverbs 30, verse 17. It says, the eye that mocks a father and scorns to obey a mother, it says, his eye will be picked out by the ravens of the valley and eaten by the vultures. Again, God's pretty serious. He's pretty serious. This sounds pretty intense of his view of your obedience to your parents. And so therefore, these two verses here, these two passages here, show God's view of disobedient children. So if God takes it this seriously, you better take it more seriously. And I don't care how seriously you take it right now. No one in this room takes obedience to their parents this seriously. None of you. None of you take obedience to your parents this seriously. I want you to turn that dial up and care about that relationship even more than you did when you walked into this room. That even on your drive home from church today, your relationship with them is more serious because you understand God's heart for that relationship specifically. Disobedience is a big deal. Obviously, it's God's command to you that you must do it, but also this pleases God, we see here in our verse. And also God honors and blesses those in this room that will go home this week, respect their parents and obey their parents and honor their parents more than they did last week. God will honor you. How do I know that? Ephesians 6. Again, we'll get there when we get to the end of Ephesians. Ephesians 6, 1 through 3. It says, children, obey your parents in the Lord, for this is right. Sounds very similar to what we just read. Honor your father and mother. He's quoting here from the Ten Commandments. It says, honor your father and mother. This is the first commandment with a promise. Because at the end of the Ten Commandments there, it says this. After honor your father and mother, it says, that it may go well with you and that you may live long in the land. Therefore, God will bless. God will honor your obedience to your parents. So therefore, you can take it seriously in terms of not disobeying them, but also take it seriously in terms of obeying them is going to bring great blessing and pleasing to God as well. So, therefore, how do I do this? What should I do? Starting when I go home today, write down this way for subpoint A. Number one thing that you should do when you go home to obey God by obeying your parents is subpoint A, by respecting their authority. By respecting their authority. That was really, in one sense, kind of the whole point of what point number one was all about. You understanding, having perspective of where they're coming from. Point number one, showed us perspective, and also to remind you of their authority. How do I know this? Verse 20, it says the word obey there is literally this compound word that is the word listen and the word under. Literally the word means to listen under. So what does that tell you? That tells you that there's someone above. If there's something under, there's something above. I think that's basic preposition conversation. You got something under, you got something above. The parents are above, the child is under. I don't think that shocked anyone that your parents have authority over you. What I want you to do is understand that you need to respect that authority and see your job as someone who's trying to obey them is you are listening under them. The same word for listen under, drop your eyes down to verse 22. It says, bondservants, obey in everything those who are your earthly masters. Bondservant was a slave. The slave was to obey his master. The child is to obey his father and his mother. It's the same word, listen under, that he uses there in that verse as well. It clearly defines who's in authority and who's in submission. So what do I mean by respect? That's kind of a vague word, respect. What do I mean? Well, I think this is something that happens oftentimes in your homes is this. Your parents tell you to do something or they discipline you, and you are tempted to talk back to them. You talk back to your parents? They say do that, you know, some snide remark of like, no, like you talk back to them. That's not respect. That's not respecting their authority. Again, cop pulls you over after, you're driving at 11:15 p.m. and he says, all right, hand over your license. It's now officially suspended. Are you going to be like, okay, dude, nice hat you got on there. Like, oh, wow, this shiny badge. Who are you? No, none of you would do that. If you ever had dealings with cops before, you're just like, okay, yes, whatever you say, like, yes, okay. There's an understanding of authority, at least you should have, of a cop, of a policeman. You should have a sense of authority. They're over me. They have the power to do something, to throw me in jail. They have got power to let me go. I understand their authority. You wouldn't talk back to a cop. Then why do you talk back to your parents? You live with them. You don't live with cops, unless your dad is one, which I don't think any of your dads are cops. So you don't live with one. You live with your parents. So therefore, talking back to them has even bigger ramifications than if you were to do that to a cop. Also, this is something that happens all the time in your relationship with your parents, is you think you know better than them. Does anyone here think your parents do something you're like, I know better than you? You don't, okay? I'm just here to tell you, you don't. You probably know, there's a handful of things that you know better than them. When parents try to do slang and they're just like, oh, bet, or like they drop these like things, you're like, oh, and you're just like, no, like, don't say that, mom, like, you're not cool, like, don't do that, don't say that. When like, more Gen Z language than they do. You know more things about, your hobbies than they do. But what I mean in a fuller sense is you don't know life better than they do. You might think you do, but you don't. You don't. And there are often times when your parents tell you to do something, you'll be tempted to reason your way out. To reason your way out of obeying them. Oh, yeah, but like, they just don't get it. So like, I'm just going to like, kind of do what they say, but like, yeah, but I mean, over here, like, here's my loophole out. That's not what respect is. Respect is say, you're my authority. Yes, I will do what you say. Again, if you thought in your mind, next time your parents told you to do something, and in your mind, kind of like, just this phrase like flashed over your brain, like, I'm not in charge. That might be a really helpful thing for you to think of. When your parents tell you to do something, you just flash in your brain, I'm not in charge. It's like, oh, they're my authority. I'm not the authority. Therefore, subpoint B, I'm going to obey them by obeying all the way. Specifically, that's what this verse tells us to do, is to go obey in everything. Subpoint B, obey all the way. This phrase here in verse 20, it says, obey your parents in everything. Not in some things, not in selective picking and choosing, not, oh, I'm going to give an excuse to get out of it. No, it's speaking in a Christian context, of course, with Christian parents, Christian children. The idea here is that you are obeying in everything, no matter what they say. And again, the obvious exception to this is when your parents tell you to sin, or they encourage you to sin. That would be outside of the word in everything. But I don't think many of you are experiencing that, where your parents are instructing you to go lie and cheat. Your parents are instructing you to say, don't go to church. Like, I don't think that's your situation. So therefore, you are under the umbrella of obeying in everything. Christian context means that your parents don't want you to sin. We just talked about that in point number 1. Therefore, you need to express that thankfulness to them about them protecting you from sin by therefore obeying them all the way, because they protected you from sin. Like, genuinely, I am so thankful for my parents, and specifically for my dad, having just such a black and white, zero tolerance policy in our house for cussing. Even the slightest of words. Again, I was one of those kids that couldn't say gosh. That was not a word that I could say. And I remember I said that one time, and I just got lit up, man. It hurt. I'll put it like that. I got spanked quite a few times. And I'm not just talking about gosh. I was talking about other cuss words as well. If ever I brought even a sliver of that into my house, I would get destroyed for it. And you know what? Looking back, I'm so thankful that my dad spanked me so hard for anything even remotely close to that. Because now on this side, frankly, this is not trying to flex or anything, I've never dealt with struggling with cussing at all. I never have. And again, I thank my parents for that specifically, because they protected me from sin that I otherwise would have had to go work on and figure out myself, because they protected me from that. Again, you go home and you thank your parents for the rules that they've set up for you, because what they're doing is they're protecting you from sin. Therefore, you can trust them to obey in everything. So what does that mean? That means that you cannot just obey them in a half-hearted manner, where they say, do all of your homework, and you do half of your homework, and then you go play video games for the other half of your homework time. You obeyed them, sure, yeah, you did your homework, but did you do all of your homework? That's the implication. Therefore, you ought to obey all the way, not half obedience, not finding loopholes. Your parents, they put screen time in your phone, right? A lot of you have screen time. And you know how to get around that, don't you? Probably, right? You do this, and you tweak that, and you save this there, and then boom, I'm around the screen time, and I can do whatever I want because I'm watching it on my Bible app or something like that. I don't know. You can figure out ways. That's called a loophole. That's called not obeying all the way. Yeah, your screen time for Instagram or YouTube or, Snapchat or whatever you're on. Which, don't be on Snapchat. I'll just put that at subpoint C. Don't be on Snapchat. Yeah, I don't know. Be real's fine, but yeah. Loophole. Yeah, nice. Thanks. The idea here is this. Don't find loopholes around obeying your parents. Don't find loopholes around obeying your parents. Just do what they say. And do it all the way, not halfway. And don't just obey when they're watching and mom and dad leave and then, great, I get to go do whatever I want. Obeying when they're watching, obeying when they're not watching is obeying all the way. Subpoint C, to continue the rhyming, by obeying right away. There you go. Obeying all the way, obey right away. Need to get serious about obeying right away. When your parents tell you to do something, you do it in a timely manner. Again, there's a major loophole for you to obey them hours later. Oh, I've got time to obey them. I'll just do it later. That's not what obedience is. Obedience is right away. Again, thinking back to the cop. Thinking back to you see a cop in your rearview mirror, and they say, hey, give me your license and registration. You don't get to say, nah, bro, I'll do it later, okay? Like, I'll get to it. Like, you don't say that. Why? Because there's a very urgent and timely manner. When a cop says, do this, you do it right away. The idea here is that obedience is mandatory urgently. Therefore, if they're your authority, you got to do it right away. How do I know this? Jesus talks about it in Luke chapter 9. He talks about it in following Jesus specifically, not referring to parents here. But I want you to see this immediate, urgent obedience here that he describes. Luke 9:52 through, not 52. Luke 9:59 through 62. He says this. To another, he says, this is Jesus talking, follow me. And then this person says, Lord, let me first go bury my father. And then Jesus said to him, leave the dead to bury their own dead. But as for you, go proclaim the kingdom of God. And another person, they come and they say, I will follow you, Lord, but let me first say farewell to those at home. And Jesus said to him, no one who puts his hand to the plow and looks back is fit for the kingdom of heaven. Notice Jesus' demand for instant obedience. Instant. I'm going to do what you say because you are my authority. Again, you are going to be tempted over Christmas break to be lazy because you're off school. You don't have to do all of the things that you normally have to do. Your temptation will be to be lazy and say, yeah, they told me to clean my room, but I've got 8 hours to do it. And maybe they don't care, and you can clarify that with them, but maybe they do care. You do it right away, urgently, in a timely manner, by obeying right away, by obeying all the way. And this one does not rhyme. Last one, subpoint D, is this: by not complaining to or about them. This is something that happens all the time, not complaining to them and not complaining about them. This is pretty common at school, is it not? You hear a lot of people complain about their parents. Don't hop in. Don't hop in. God placed your parents there on purpose. They are not there by mistake. They are there by God's perfect design. Every single one of your parents, God put there because he wants those two people, to be there. Romans 13:1, referring to governing authorities, it says this. It says, there is no authority except from God. And those who exist, they have been instituted by God. Therefore, every authority in all of life has been instituted, placed there specifically by God. Therefore, you honor your parents by the way that you talk to them. Your words should reflect their authority. Even your body language. Let's get down to body language. That ought to respect them. When your mom says, do this, and you roll your eyes at her, you are not respecting her. You are not honoring her as the authority by rolling your eyes or sitting there and be like, oh, okay, fine, whatever, okay. That's not respect. Respect is saying, you're my authority. I'm not going to complain to you. But also, when I go to school, I'm not going to complain about you either. Let complaining about your parents not even be in your vocabulary. Like, put it up there with cussing. Like, just, it's not even in your vocabulary. You're saying, I'm not going to do it. My friends, they bag on their parents all the time. I'm not hopping in to this conversation. I'm not going to say, yeah, my parents are the worst too. Because I know that my parents aren't the worst. They want to see me not sin. So therefore, they're the best. The idea here is that you need to obey your parents, honor God. And again, I understand, maybe last week, sermon on gluttony, everyone was like, oh, cool, like, talking about food, like, oh, I've never thought of that before, like, oh, okay, like, I'm going to think about my cookies now from now on, like, cool, gluttony, won't do it. This one, like, no one's going to, like, you're not going to go hop on Be Real and be like, respecting my parents today, like, it's just not going to happen. This is not a cool topic. It's not a super cool topic to respect your parents, but it's an important one. It's one that God cares about, and you will be tempted to not care about it in your 2 or 3 weeks over Christmas break. I want you to care about it. I want you to obey them. I want you to obey them in everything. And again, I understand how difficult this is. Your relationship with your parents is difficult. It is hard. It is hard. And some of you are genuinely, we can just say this outright, some of you are enslaved to the sin of disrespecting your parents. You're enslaved to it. You cannot get out of it. You've tried before and you just can't do it. I want to tell you this morning, you can repent of that sin. You can turn from that sin, not by your power, but by the power of the Holy Spirit. Like, genuinely, to let you see inside of me for a moment, like, this was one of the sins I was enslaved to before I became a Christian. I got saved freshman year of high school. I was so disrespectful to my mom, specifically. Not my dad as much. I mean, kind of, but like my mom, I was super disrespectful to. And it was obvious. And our relationship was rough. And then I got saved and I understood, now I can actually successfully, by the power of the Holy Spirit, do it. I can now obey her. Again, all of this is not just you cleaning up your life and doing better. This is you submitting your will to the Holy Spirit, submitting your will to God and obeying him with the power that he gives you. And again, you cannot do it on your own. You need to repent. You need to ask for forgiveness. You need to ask God to give you the power to say no to the sin of disrespect of your parents and give you the power to obey them by obeying God at the same time. So let's bow our heads and pray. Let's go out and honor and respect and obey our parents this week. Let's bow our heads and pray. God, we thank you so much for this reminder this morning. God, a painful one for many, I'm sure. Talking about a relationship with parents is difficult, but God, I do pray that you would use this text and this time together to confront sin where it needs to be confronted. And God, that you would allow these students to go home this afternoon even and to honor and obey their parents, respect them in ways that they never have before. God, I pray for every parent to see the fruit of even this sermon, even this time together in this text. God, and they would rejoice in seeing a son or a daughter respond in obedience to them. God, I know, just even being on the other side of it, how much joy it is to see a son respond in obedience. And so, God, I do pray for the parents that are out there in the other room. God, may you let them see that joy of their son or their daughter responding in obedience and honor and respect of them as they are the authority you've placed in their lives. We pray these things in Jesus' name. Amen.